Welcome to Embracing Autism IRL. Today, we're thrilled to have Jerry Kolber join us. Jerry is an Emmy-nominated co-creator of Brain Games on National Geographic, co-creator of Netflix's Brainchild with Pharrell Williams, and host of the hit kids podcast Who Smarted with over 15 million downloads. In this episode, we'll explore how Jerry's innovative approach to edutainment creates accessible, engaging content for neurodiverse learners, including autistic children. From his strategies behind Brain Games and Who Smarted to advice for parents and educators, Jerry will share insights on fostering inclusion in education and celebrating the unique strengths of autistic learners. Let's dive in. Welcome, Jerry. It's an absolute honor to have you on the show.
Thanks, Leah. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Jerry, can you share a little bit more about how your journey in creating educational content shaped your understanding of these diverse learning needs? And also, for those listening out there, what is edutainment?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's start with what is edutainment. So we think of edutainment as any kind of entertainment that is fun to watch, that's engaging, but that you can actually get either smarter about yourself or start to understand something about your world through the experience of watching that show. So it's education and entertainment, edutainment. As far as diverse learning styles, so my whole journey to starting to create edutainment is because I was never diagnosed with autism, but I definitely struggled in traditional classroom settings, like even with subjects I was interested in. I would be like super interested in, hands-on science stuff outside of school and learning about math and how the universe worked. But as soon as you plopped me down in a classroom and a textbook, I'm like, what? Like, I just couldn't connect with it. And I don't know exactly what the issue was, but I definitely had a different learning style than the one that was required to be a good student in those things. And so my natural curiosity combined with my TV career at some point led me to this opportunity to create a show about the brain for Nat Geo. And that was a show called Brain Games. And Brain Games was it was an interactive, it is an interactive show where you're actually playing along with the show. And the show is actually reflecting back to you how your brain works or as expected or doesn't work as expected. It helps you understand yourself and other people better. And in order to make that work, we had to create incredibly clear and structured and like very sensory rich experiences in the show to engage everybody to play the games. And it happens that one of the best ways for many neurodiverse learners, including those on the autism spectrum, to learn is with very clear, very structured and sensory rich information. And we actually didn't know that going in, but we started to hear from people who were autistic, who were really appreciating the show, either because it was helping them understand their own brains better, or it was helping them understand something about their own situation. And so once we understood that, we actually kind of leaned into it more, because we're like, that's a really interesting thing, that like the same thing that makes for a great TV experience and an easy TV experience also is very easy for neurodiverse learners.
That's pretty cool. I think that definitely is the case for my kid. I have two autistic kids that are also ADHD, recently diagnosed, so they're ADHD. And I definitely noticed that for the middle kid, she's very, very fleeting attention. And so she definitely needs more of that edutainment style of learning to kind of really ingest the information. So I think that's pretty cool. I wanted to ask you, when it comes to actually designing this content, how do you approach that? And how do you design content that you feel will resonate with kids whose brains think a little differently?
That's a really interesting question. So my brain thinks a little differently. And again, like I said, I've never been diagnosed autistic. But I definitely know that I don't think the same way most people think. And that there's something about, I have this ability to look at a complex concept and explain it in a way that's quite simple. And I think that really, again, I think that also aligns with neurodiverse learning styles. The other thing that I love is putting interesting information into a story, right? And so that's another thing that really works for neurodiverse learners is attaching emotion to the information, making it interesting beyond just delivering the information. So like storytelling, sensory experiences, sounds, lights, all the things that we can do in TV shows and podcasts. And then the other thing is that, again, it happens to align really well, is like predictable patterns, right? And repetition. Is our research and anecdotally has shown us that's also very effective for neurodiverse learners, is to repeat and then to do it in a predictable pattern. That also, again, it happens to be a great way to get a slightly distracted neurotypical learner to also pay attention. So, it's fortunate that the way that we design our shows for everyone also really happens to work well for the neurodiverse community.
So you mentioned a little bit about like your research and how you guys design your shows. Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Yeah.
What do you mean by like research? Like what is the process? What are you guys actually doing?
So there's two kinds of research we do. One is we're constantly looking at academic journals. We're reaching out to scientists, anyone who publishes something interesting about the human brain or the way that we learn or behavioral psychology. You're probably going to get a phone call or email from me at some point because I'm like super curious about that. So we're always just learning from that kind of research. And then we also do, I would call that sort of secondhand research. But we also do direct research, which is sometimes it's literally reaching out to families who are listening to our show and doing surveys and interviews with them. We've also hired teams of STEM consultants to talk to us about the best ways to teach for different ages of kids and different kinds of learners, and whether that's neurodiverse learners or kids who are learning more from physical experiences or kids who learn more musically. We actually engage with researchers to look at our projects and tell us. And then we've also gone as deep as hiring. At one point we hired a team from UCLA called the UCLA Center for Scholars and Storytellers to actually work with us on developing a program for younger children, because we wanted to make sure we were reaching those kids where they are, right? Not where we want them to be, but reaching them where their cognitive skills are and where their ability to learn was. So it's everything from like the secondhand research to direct research.
So out of curiosity, was there any particular finding that you found very challenging when it came to that design process or that research? Was there some outcome that came from that you're like, ooh, I don't know, how are we going to do this?
It's interesting. So the time that I found most challenging with the research was when we were working with UCLA. That project was for 3 to 5 year olds. It was a show called The Deep Blue Sea. And the idea was that in every episode, we'd introduce children to a different sea creature and let them learn about that sea creature. And we are very, at this point, very knowledgeable and very deeply versed in how to speak to our core audience, which are like 6 to 11-year-old kids. Like we get that at our core. Turns out 3 to 5-year-olds have a wildly different way of learning. And so the pace of the show is so much slower than what we're used to. We're like usually like, and we're like, okay, we gotta like pump the brakes for these kids. And even like with Who Smarted, which is our podcast, our main family podcast for kids, we'll deliver lots of information, and we know kids might walk away with a couple of pieces, but with younger kids, we were told, like, we tested a bunch of different approaches. It's really like 3 key pieces of information over a 6-minute show is about the max that they can retain. So that was challenging and interesting, but it worked. I mean, the show, every kid who finds that show loves it. So
you said 3 to 6 pieces of information?
3 pieces.
3 pieces.
Over like a 6-minute episode.
Okay. Yeah. That's like half of an adult, because I think with adults it's closer to like 6 to 8 with if you're chunking.
Yeah.
But yeah. Wow. That's not a lot to work with.
Yeah. Well, you have a neuroscience background, so I like throwing around the term chunking like everyone knows what that means.
Oh yeah, the audience might not know. Sorry, guys. So that's just putting things in basically bite-sized chunks for people to retain information. Yeah. So with Who Smarted, can you tell me a little bit more about like the premise behind that and how that basically addresses some of this edutainment, trying to help educate while entertaining kids?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So Who Smarted actually started during the pandemic, and we obviously couldn't go out and shoot any of our TV shows. And we had all of these wonderful researchers and writers and educators and producers on staff. And we thought, kids are going to be on their screens all day, playing games in the morning, on Zoom school all day, on the screen doing the homework, on the screen watching TV. So let's create a screen-free option for them. To get off of the screens, but still have fun and learn. And that became Who Smarted. And the idea was to create something so fun that it would be competitive to playing a video game, right? Because we always think of like, we're not competing with other podcasts. We're competing with every other thing a kid could do to get their attention. So we're like, it has to be super fun, super relatable, feels like an adventure. And then within the core of that, along the way, the learning is incidental, right? So you're learning because you're on this journey, and along the way we have quizzes in the show, which keeps kids really engaged and really like gets them leaning in and keeps them focused because they know quizzes coming up, but they're fun quizzes. There's no really high stakes. So all of those ideas went into Who Smarted, and it just became this kind of phenomena that like survived and thrived beyond the pandemic.
I absolutely love that. That might be my kids' new nighttime routine because we're running out of podcasts. But that is really, I think, helpful for kids in particular who have like ADHD or even on the autism side of things for a couple of reasons. I think one of them is I feel like with my kids, I've noticed if they're watching too many of those like flashy YouTube videos, there's a lot of like visual stimulation and a lot of like flashing colors, switching screens. And I feel like sometimes because of that, with the ADHD component, it honestly makes them kind of lose focus.
Yeah.
So they're not really like retaining the information. So when you have just the audio component, I feel like that makes it easier for them to focus. And then on the autism side of things, you can get that like sensory overwhelm. So if you're too like overwhelmed with all the visuals, I mean, you're obviously not a kid, but have you seen kids shows today? They are like they're crazy. They're like
Yeah.
strobe lights.
Yeah. Which they're doing that, like that's all intentional because the research shows
Dopamine hits.
that is a dopamine. Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, and like I'm all for screens have their place, kids love it. I get it. But there is a lot of research going back decades that will tell you that is actually not just neutral, but can be negative for a kid's cognitive development because it's creating this kind of addiction reward neural pathway that's totally artificial, and it's actually hurting their ability to focus long term if they're just on screens all the time. So we just say, not as a pitch necessarily for Who Smarted, but for any kind of audio podcast that a family can listen to, anything that gets kids off screens but lets you still have an experience together and like have a fun time and ask questions. Like it's good for their brains to get them off the screen sometimes. You know that, but
Yeah.
but
Well,
it's a science thing. It's not just a feeling.
I heard that because of the pandemic, we got kind of like a what would you call it? Kind of like an induced quasi autism ADHD generation. So it's like these kids probably wouldn't have gotten an autism or ADHD diagnosis had they not been raised and born during the pandemic where there was a lot more screen time, digital learning, and all of that stuff. So it totally makes sense that this generation of kids have been kind of oversaturated with technology and
Yeah.
screens. So I love that you're providing like an alternative. It's definitely something I would like for my kids because we try to minimize our screen time.
Awesome.
So I also wanted to ask you, there's different ways to basically create like educational systems and environments to help support autistic kids, autistic students. How can you do that with edutainment? Is that like something that you think is valuable for autistic individuals to maybe help create environments that are more supportive in their learning styles? Or do you feel like that's something that maybe is not the best when it comes to neurodiverse individuals?
I think it's great. I think it's a great option. I mean, because the thing that I think people lose is they just don't understand is that people who are neurodiverse or autistic are as curious, if not oftentimes even more curious than neurotypical learners. And that gets like I just don't think enough. I don't think there's enough education around the idea of what those terms mean. And the fact is, like, if you can create any kind of edutainment that is going to meet a neurodiverse person, it like where they live in terms of how they consume information, and you're making it easier for them to learn, to pique their curiosity, to get excited about a subject, and then go explore more about that, that's a huge win. And so I think edutainment has a huge place in that. And I'll say, like, one of the things, again, like, as I said, like we I don't want to sit here and say, like, I set out to design Who's Smarted to work perfectly for autistic children, but it happens that the way that we think about creating entertainment, which is, kind of short bite-sized segments, um, lots of sensory stimulus without being overstimulating, not having a screen, having it be all audio. We've heard from so many parents of autistic children over the years that Who Smarted is like the thing that their kids love listening to, and that gets them excited on their way to school, that helps them like settle down. And sometimes they tell us it's like one of the only like podcasts or shows that their kids can listen to and experience without getting overstimulated. And so once we learned that, then it became something we kept in mind, right? And so that's been like really gratifying to hear.
Yeah, it reminds me of the example when it comes to like in public and people are making wheelchair accesses, that people are like, "Oh, I have to design this wheelchair ramp because it'll help this person get up on the curb or this or that." And people are thinking exclusively of the person with the disability. But you don't realize that incidentally you end up helping like the person who's temporarily using crutches,
Yeah.
maybe the little old lady down the street. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a similar thing with this concept where you don't necessarily go out there with the intent of helping all these neurodivergent individuals, but as a consequence of making it so simplistic and so focused on this, brain behavior and stuff, you inadvertently do that.
Yeah.
So it kind of works out.
That's a great example. With your permission, I'd like to
Oh
use
yeah,
that in the future. I was like, wow, that's really perfect, actually.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I'd be honored.
Thank you.
And so I want to also ask you, because a lot of times people think about education and educational content as like this kind of boring, bland, just repetitive, learn facts type of thing. I've been dabbling in like homeschooling and I've seen a lot of that. I honestly wish there was better designed homeschool curriculums. But my question for you is like, what role do you have in terms of incorporating creativity in there or creative play or designing educational content that really makes it so that it's not just work, it does feel entertaining and it
Mhm.
feels like their brains are being stimulated?
It's hard to do, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons there's not a lot of it is it actually, it both takes the desire to like think, how do I make this fun? And then you also need quite a set of skill sets, because you have to really, yes, it has to be fun, but it still has to be educational. And so it's something that, we here at my company have been doing this for almost 15 years, and we've gotten better and better at it all the time. There's other resources you're starting to see more people creating gamified learning and education that's fun. But we see that as our role. Like we don't think of ourselves as educators. We think or homeschoolers, like homeschool curriculum designers, so to speak. But we see everything we do as being helpful to educators and helpful to parents and helpful to homeschoolers, because Who Smarted and our other show, Mysteries About True Histories, are so fun and educational. You can use them in that setting to get kids excited about either a particular topic, or a lot of people use our shows just to get kids to settle down on the way back from lunch or recess or to start the day. So that's actually where I see these kinds of edutainment projects being most useful, is to just prime the pump, like get the kids like settled. It's like, oh, I'm learning and it's fun, and now it's time for curriculum that I have to go through. But at that point, they're like ready to have fun and learn. So
Absolutely.
that's where I really see it fitting in the most.
So, what advice would you give, or what have you learned from working in the edutainment system that you feel might help parents and educators foster environments that really celebrate the unique strengths of these unique learning styles of neurodivergent and autistic kids?
I mean, you said it perfectly. Like, celebrating unique strengths. I mean, that's the core of it, right? Because autistic kids have unique strengths. I mean, that's undeniable. And it's like getting to know that child and understanding what their strengths are, both in terms of what they do, what's their superpower, and then also what's the way that they learn best, is so critical to meeting those kids where they are and giving them an experience to grow. Simple things that kind of relate to what we do in the show that I think you can bring into a homeschool or a home or a classroom using visual supports is huge. I know you probably know this, but like autistic children tend to really respond well to visually displayed information. So however you can make something more visual, if you're talking about, state capitals, having like a big map with like pictures that show like, a potato for Idaho and like an orange for Florida and like the name of the capital, little things like that go a long way with neurodiverse kids. And then just, sensory breaks, right? So like being aware of when children might be getting too much information or too much stimulus and they're saying like, let's take a break. Let's jump around a little or go outside for some air, is sort of the classroom equivalent of what we do in our shows, where it's like information, and then there's like a little bit of fun and then more information. So just having those little breaks. And then the last thing I would say is, wherever possible, like encouraging collaboration with other kids, because it's not only going to provide support for each other, it's also an opportunity for other kids to start to understand what autism is, because it then takes some of the stigma away. And that's something we hear from a lot of parents of autistic kids, is that their experience comes sometimes with, it's like a little rough for them because the other kids don't understand. And so destigmatizing it and helping other kids understand by like really engaging can go a long way towards just making the experience more supportive for an autistic kid.
Yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head there. Unfortunately, one of the things that autistic children struggle with is that social integration piece. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you think that we can help these learners navigate those challenges in educational settings? And what role do you feel that content creators play in kind of facilitating that?
I think that, well, I'll tell you on like a very big picture level, like, so because we've had so many parents of autistic children reach out to us and say how much their child enjoys Who Smarted. We've been getting asked to do an episode of Who Smarted on autism for years. And to be honest, we shied away from it because we were like, if we get this wrong, we're going to do more harm than good. Right. Like, like if we don't make the perfect episode about Jupiter, okay, but like,
I don't know, an autistic kid might not like if you don't make the perfect episode of Jupiter.
they don't, and they let us know. And we love that. But we really were like, oh, we can only do this if we get it right. And at one point, a family reached out to us and said, asked again. And we were like, all right, well, let's ask this family this question. Would you guys help us make the episode? And so we ended up working with the family and the child on creating the episode so that the character in the episode who plays the autistic child is really demonstrating the experience that one of our listeners has in his elementary school. And it really was an opportunity to just unpack a lot of misunderstandings around autism. And it was so successful that we received so many letters and reviews from children saying things like, thank you, there's an autistic kid in my class and I just couldn't understand what was going on, and now I'm actually making friends with them. And just so like those kind of impacts, I think, as storytellers and creators, if you can create material that helps shift a misunderstanding or helps shift people towards understanding and compassion, that's huge. And so that's where I really see that fitting in.
That's awesome. There really is not enough resources out there. And anytime I hear about one that could potentially help my kid, I really get excited about that, because unfortunately there just is not enough understanding. And my kids have gotten bullied in public because of their disability. So I am so glad to hear that that exists. So I wanted to ask you just a couple more things because we're nearing the end here, unfortunately. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, in your opinion, what do you feel are some common misconceptions about neurodiverse learners that you think educators or content creators should be mindful of when they're designing their work or designing their content?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it's actually something I kind of learned in creating this episode, because between the research and talking to the family, is that there seems to be this common misconception that neurodiverse learners can't handle complexity, right? It's almost this idea that there's some sort of simplicity happening in their mind, and it's like nothing could be further from the truth. we discovered through conversations with these kids and through the research, and you can tell me if this jives with your experience, but that neurodiverse kids actually love complexity. It's just that they need it often broken down into like more manageable and like meaningful pieces than other kids, and that's a little bit of a harder lift, right, for a teacher, because instead of explaining like typically, how like a math equation works, it's like you need to break it down, but not just like into just like chop it up. You have to like make each section meaningful and explain it in a way that's relatable. So that's one thing that we learned. And then the other was just that idea, and this goes back to my experience in schools, like this one size fits all approach to teaching. It just doesn't work, especially with neurodiverse children. And that's a really also challenging thing, because teachers are overwhelmed and they have like so much going on, and they've got their own lives and a million kids are dealing with. And so it's hard to move the needle on that. But like understanding that you really have to really, especially with neurodiverse kids, like really personalize their educational experience. I mean, those are the two big things that I came away with.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the learning style difference, you're right. There is definitely like a smaller chunking that has to happen. But at the same time, it's often much deeper level of understanding than everyone else. So I feel like usually like peers, neurotypical peers, they learn a lot about, or they learn a little bit about a lot. Whereas an autistic person tends to want to learn a lot about something small and narrow at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, like, for me, retaining mathematical concepts and all that stuff, people thought I couldn't do it, but it was because I couldn't do it all at once.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to chunk it out, and then I ended up acing calculus. But
Wow.
people don't have patience for that. So I had to take it twice to get the A, but I aced it and ended up teaching other people. So it's just, if people had patience, they would see like autistic individuals and neurodiverse people aren't dumb. They just need a different learning style. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they need it presented in a different way.
Yeah.
So you're right on the nose with that one.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not just like I go one step beyond that and say it's not just about like doing that because that's how autistic or neurodiverse people learn, but like your mind works differently than other minds. And you know what the best way to come up with solutions to problems that everyone else hasn't figured out how to do? Have someone who thinks different work on it.
Absolutely.
And so educate people who are children who are autistic. Take your time, activate them, like activate their curiosity, let them go deep where other kids go narrow, because man, we got some problems, and like it would not surprise me if neurodiverse children who are kids now, who are like really treated properly and respectfully and like activated, and their minds are loved, they're going to solve problems for the rest of us. So
Absolutely. As long as society does not pulverize their self-esteem, because that's the issue.
yeah.
You get
Yeah.
bullied and then you think you can't, but you actually can accomplish a lot. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So, this is my favorite question. I like to ask everybody this question. It is time to ask you, what does embracing autism mean to you?
I'd say after making that autism episode for Who Smarted, for me, it's just really about like celebrating the individual strengths of autistic learners, and recognizing that they are they have a gift, right? It's not necessarily like people say sometimes it's like they're different in a way that there's like a negativity associated with it, and instead look at it as like, man, like this person is so interesting and different, and like embracing the creative way that autistic children approach problems, and even socializing. Like, we don't all have to socialize the same way. Like, don't have to try and force round pegs into a square hole, like let them be the round peg with all the other square objects. So I think just celebrating that individuality is really important. And also just, what I've experienced in my own life, the more I celebrate my own diverse way of thinking, the more I have breakthroughs and help people. And so I think that for me, like, it's a very personal thing, but I apply that to autistic people as well, is just celebrate what's different and love it.
Well, I can definitely tell you're really passionate about what you do. I can hear it in your voice and the way you talk. It's definitely something that I'm passionate about too, so I can relate. So I want to make sure, Jerry, as we're wrapping up here, I want to make sure that our listeners can find you or find where you are.
Sure.
You have a website, social media. Where can my
Yeah.
listeners go?
Yeah, the best place if you want to check out Who Smarted, which is our flagship educational series, that's at whosmarted.com, or search Who Smarted on any podcast player. And then our show Mysteries About True Histories is Who Smarted is a 3 times weekly 15-minute show on all kinds of topics. Mysteries About True Histories really teaches kids about math and history. That's also available free anywhere. And then the last thing, and you can find me on LinkedIn at Jerry-Kolber. You can put in the show notes. Last thing I'll say is we offer a free subscription to our ad-free version of Who Smarted for all educators at whosmarted.com if they click on educators, so they can use it in the classroom without any concern about advertisements.
Awesome. So you guys heard that. I will take the notes and put them in the show notes or the show note description for y'all. Thank you again, Jerry, so much for coming on the show. This was really interesting conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time. Hope you
Thank
have a
you.
good
It's a
one.
real pleasure. Thanks, Leah.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.